Well, greetings to everyone. It's Paul J. Leslie with Expanding Perceptions. And today I am with someone that I am really excited to talk to. I have been a long time a fan of his work, and he is with me today. It's Dr. Bernardo Kastrup. Now, Dr. Kastrup is one of the leading figures, in my opinion, in the area of consciousness studies, and then specifically what we refer to as metaphysical idealism. He has a doctorate in computer engineering, has worked in artificial intelligence, and has a doctorate in philosophy. His work's been showcased in such journals as Scientific America, Institute of Art and Ideas. He's written over 10 books and probably more to come. And today I get to chat with him. So Bernardo, thanks so much for being with me.
Pleasure to be with you, Paul.
Okay, great. Well, just to start with, people who might not really be familiar with the idea of idealism, this is something that I just like for you to, in just a moment, give an overview of your position. I know you've done it a million times, but I've noticed as someone who teaches psychology, in all the introductory psychology books I've reviewed, I've used, there's a chapter on consciousness. But the bulk of the chapter about consciousness generally talks about dualism and materialism. It's just a little bit, and then it jumps into things that change consciousness, like drugs and hypnosis. So I don't think the average person really has an understanding of the distinctions we're making about what consciousness is, and this idea of idealism, which is not a new idea, but it's something that I think you've refined. So could you speak to that for me?
Sure. The mainstream view is that what is really real is matter, and matter is defined as something that is outside and independent of mind and has no intrinsic qualities. It doesn't have color, it doesn't have flavor. And the qualities are something that somehow are generated by your brain inside your skull. So the colors you see around you are actually not supposed to be around you at all. They are supposed to be all inside your skull, within the inner chamber of your skull, because your brain is supposed to generate them. Now, idealism is the notion that the entire world is mental. And then people immediately tend to misunderstand that by interpreting it as the assertion that the entire world is in your head. No, that's materialism. It's materialism that says that the world of qualities is in your head, that there is a real world outside, but that real world is pure abstraction. It's your brain that translates that into the qualities inside your head. Idealism acknowledges that there is a real objective world out there beyond our individual minds. Idealism only says is that that objective world out there is also mental, just like your mind. It's not in your mind. It does not depend on fantasies, but it is also mental in the same way that somebody else's mind, although not accessible to you, is also mental. And you believe that. You believe that I have a mental inner life, although it's not yours and it's separate from you. So the idealist would say the entire world, not only other people, are fundamentally mental processes, transpersonal mental processes, which appear on the screen of perception as what we call matter. And under an idealist understanding, matter is a representation, an extrinsic appearance of what is essentially transpersonal mental processes out there, or personal mental processes. If you see tears falling down from somebody's face, that's the extrinsic appearance of inner sadness. So the idealist would say the inner sadness is the thing in itself, and the tears, the contorted facial muscles, and the quasars and stars and black holes and galaxies, all of these things are representations of outside mental processes on our screen of perception.
Now, the way you explain it, to me, this is very clear. But I think there's a hesitancy for a lot of people to even consider that mind is primary, because I think our experience tells us the complete opposite. But as you've pointed out, and I'd like for you to kind of speak to this as well, the idea that mind is not primary has absolutely no real scientific empirical basis for either when you
Oh,
look at that.
materialism has entire categories of insoluble problems. It doesn't have explanatory power because nobody has ever managed to articulate how physical parameters can allow us to deduce the qualities of experience. These two domains are incommensurable. And materialism is contradicted by the latest results in foundations of physics and the neuroscience of consciousness. In foundations of physics now, it's very difficult to not acknowledge that experiments have shown that physical entities do not have standalone existence. They themselves are appearances, just as idealism suggests. And in the neuroscience of consciousness now, there are whole categories of observations in which brain activity reduces while inner experience intensifies and becomes richer. So it's difficult to explain that in materialist terms. So, and materialism has internal contradictions as well. The hard problem of consciousness, the reversal of description and thing described. We define matter as a list of numbers like mass, charge, geometric relationships, amplitude, frequency, and so on. And we forget that these are descriptions of the qualitative world we see around us. Materialism takes those descriptions and they say, well, the descriptions precede the things described, which is an internal contradiction. It's a reversal of logic. So whatever the truth is, it's very, very safe to say today that materialism is false because there are so many reasons why we can extract that conclusion.
Yeah, I'm reminded of the work of Alfred Korzybski in General Semantics, where he always said the map is not the territory. It's like a lot of people have mistaken the description, which is the map, for what it is. And as you say, it's almost like they've switched these around because, I mean, realistically, it does feel a certain way to us. But, if anything in my training in psychotherapy has shown me, just because something feels a certain way doesn't mean that it's really that way.
Well, the feeling that you're referring to, I would dare to say it's not even really a proper intuition. It's the result of a number of hidden assumptions that we inherit from culture. For instance, when Samuel Johnson famously kicked a stone and said, I refute Berkeley's idealism thus, by kicking the stone and feeling pain on his foot. He was appealing to the qualities of experience, the solidity of the stone. But the qualities of experience are mental. The real stone under materialism has no solidity insofar as solidity is an experiential quality. It's pure abstraction. So Johnson was basically acknowledging what idealism says, that the stone is a qualitative thing. It's a mental thing. It has solidity. It has texture. You can't move it just by wishing it to be away, in the same sense that you can't control your dreams or that you can't control your anxieties and your neuroses and your hallucinations. Mental stuff happens all the time out of our control. We don't even control our thoughts and feelings. And we don't even need to go to dreams and hallucinations. We don't control our next thought. And another part of this misunderstanding is that, and a lot of people say that with a lot of pride as if it were logical. People say, well, if a surgeon takes a scalpel to your brain, a very material thing, something will change in your inner life. So clearly material things cause experiences. You drink alcohol, it's a material thing, and your inner experience changes. Somebody punches you in the face, something happens in your inner experience. If I prick your arm with a needle, a material thing, then experience follows. So of course, experience is called my material things. Well, where is the problem in this line of thinking? Where is the fallacy? The fallacy is that it's assuming dualism. It's assuming that there is material stuff and mental stuff. Under idealism, that needle that pricked you, the surgeon's scalpel, the alcohol in the bottle, the pill you swallow, or that fist that punched you in the face, all these things themselves are images of mental processes, not your mental processes, other people mental processes, or transpersonal mental processes like the scalpel or the needle. And they interfere with your inner life because mental processes of a certain type interfere with mental processes of another type. This happens every day. Our thoughts interfere with our emotions causatively, and the other way around. So that a surgeon's scalpel changes your inner life is an event of the exact same form. It's a transpersonal mental process, which looks like a scalpel interfering with your personal mental processes. And that's all there is to it. There is no dualism, and there is no matter defined as something outside and independent of mind. Now, and this is important, the thing we colloquially call matter, of course, exists. I mean, I'm drinking water from a metal bottle. If I call this matter colloquially, this exists, all right? To me, this is the image of a transpersonal mental process. It's how a transpersonal mental process presents itself to my observation. It's encoded on the screen of my perception because that's what evolution has done to allow us to collect information from what's happening outside at a glance. But I don't deny what we colloquially call material stuff. What I deny is the definition of matter under metaphysical materialism in terms of something that is outside and independent of mentation.
The thing that bothers me a lot is there's some who hang on to this idea, and I think a lot of it is got kind of pushed by Dr. Daniel Dennett, that the easiest way to say is that consciousness doesn't exist. It just doesn't exist. And it kind of reminds me of when they were trying to solve the paradox uh, theorem back in I think it was the 40s or 50s. And Bertrand said, well, the best way to deal with it is just not to deal with it and just say it doesn't exist. Where at worst, I think, way of looking at that particular structure there. But this idea that consciousness doesn't exist, I've often wondered, well, if we're having the experience of something that doesn't exist, that's still an experience. What is your kind of thought on that?
Yeah, Galen Strawson calls Dennett's illusionism the silliest idea that has ever been conceived by human thought, which it is, because even if everything is an illusion in the sense that nothing is what it appears to be, the illusion itself is already an instance of consciousness, an instance of experience. In other words, an instance of that whose existence Dennett is trying to deny. So to say that consciousness is an illusion, if anything, is a reaffirmation of the existence of consciousness, because illusions happen only in consciousness.
Mhm.
Now, illusionists have been confronted with this obvious refutal for decades now. Some of them still insist on this, like Keith Frankish. And the way they go about it is to tie themselves in a tortuously uh, complex web of knots that they themselves don't know how to get out. In other words, they tie themselves up in so much complexity that they can't see through it. So they just hand wave and say, beyond that which I can see, and therefore beyond that which I can say, I know that this whole thing about consciousness is just an illusion. That's pure hand waving. It made no sense. So how can people dare to put forward an idea that immediately self-implodes? Why are they not ashamed of it? Because they know that materialism must be true, right? And it has to be true, right? That's what our culture says. And since nothing explains how it can possibly be true, on the contrary, everything suggests that it's not true, then if you know that it is true, then the reason it's true has to be extremely complicated and beyond the human ability to explicitly and coherently lay out in words. Dennett has been going around in circles for decades now. He never really completed his ontology, completed his theory in the sense of laying it out in a way that's internally consistent and explicit. It's just decades of hand waving, appeals to disconnected experimental results, appeals to complexity, suggestions, nothing that is just laid out so we all can understand. And of course, it will never be that because it's almost pathological.
Mm-hmm. You know, a philosophical friend of mine said that he felt Dennett wasn't really putting forth a theory. He was just, and he's British, so he used the term, he's just taking the piss out the field. And because it does in a way, it would kind of be funny and cool if it was all just this big see who bought it, to say that this doesn't exist. Well, playing on what you're saying, I think an excellent example. I'd really like you to kind of talk about that you've used that really kind of got my brain thinking in a different way about the idea of idealism and consciousness in general. Use the very rare, but sometimes shows itself disorder called what we call dissociative identity disorder. And for non-psychology people, that's multiple personality disorder. Most psychologists think it is incredibly rare, but there are documented cases of it showing itself. Your take on that's really fascinating. Could you discuss that example in the context of our discussion?
Yeah, it's a DID, dissociative identity disorder, according to the DSM-5. DSM,
Yeah, DSM.
right? Yeah,
Yeah.
DSM-5, yeah.
Mhm.
It's probably rare in the office of regular counselors and therapists. For people working in public psychiatry in the Netherlands, it's not rare at all. I'm in contact with a doctor that works for what we call the GGD, the GGD, which is the publicly funded healthcare infrastructure of the country. So they deal with tough cases, the cases that you will not see. So beyond just simple neurosis. And it's not rare for them at all. It seems to be a defense, a psychological defense mechanism, this fragmentation of awareness that is very popular for people to deal with, the realities of 21st century life. For a long time, we have known DID clinically. Since the 19th century, we have documentation for it. But until the turn of the century, the turn of the 21st century, so 20 years ago, when neuroimaging became widespread and many studies were done with neuroimaging, measuring patterns of brain activity, there was still a possibility entertained by a great many professionals that the supposed patients were dissimulating the idea that they just wanted attention. That was their coping mechanism, to pretend to have an unbelievable disorder, multiple personalities, in order to get attention. But the neuroimaging has revolutionized this. DID can now be diagnosed through fMRI, through EEG. There was this amazing study in Germany 7 years ago, a woman with many dissociated personalities or alters, seemingly split off, separate centers of awareness. And some of these alters claim to be blind. So the psychiatrists had a brilliant idea of hooking her up to an EEG. And sure enough, when a blind alter was in executive control, brain activity in the visual cortex at the back of the brain would disappear, although her eyes were open. And when a sighted alter would assume executive control, normal brain activity would be restored to the visual cortex. That's not something you can pretend. And it shows that dissociation is not only capable of fragmenting your awareness into seemingly distinct centers of awareness, it goes as far as to render you literally blind to what is right in front of your eyes. So it's a very powerful and now undeniable psychological dynamics.
What fascinates me is that when I share studies like this and examine that, that's real quick to say, well, it's like the placebo effect, but that's beyond, to me, this idea of any kind of placebo. I'm speaking in a broad term, and it's truly a major shift, not just neurologically, but in this big sense of consciousness. Do you have any ideas why the bulk of psychology hasn't approached it from that perspective? Because what they seem to do is we approach it, like more of a treatment thing, as in, somebody's been traumatized and all that. But seeing that from a bigger picture, do you think that may be the easiest way for them to actually start treating, is to look at it from this different perspective?
I think validating what people report, if we have very good reasons to validate it, is important. These people are not lying, they are not dissimulating, they are not just trying to get attention. Let me mention, and the placebo effect, two comments on that. One, we don't know what the mechanisms are of the placebo effect. We only know that it's getting stronger and stronger. We know that people can get rid of warts through hypnosis, and warts are caused by viruses. So, and drug companies are increasingly worried about the increasing efficacy of the placebo effect, because to get a new drug approved, they have to prove that the new drug is X% better than placebo, but placebo is getting better and better. That's a challenge for drug companies. So that's one point. We don't know how that works. We don't know what the mechanism there is. We don't know how people can stop having physical knee pain if they get a placebo operation, which we know is the case.
Mhm.
And another comment is, and let me mention another study done here in the Netherlands in 2014 by Jolanda Schlumpf and her team. They got a group of patients diagnosed with DID and a group of actors instructed to pretend to themselves that they were dissociated. It's a known acting technique. You try to embody your character by pretending to yourself that you are that person. So these actors were instructed to pretend to themselves that they had DID, and both groups were put under an fMRI to take readings of brain activity. And they wanted to know whether it would have been possible to diagnose and separate the DID patients from the actors by looking only at the fMRI images. And lo and behold, that was possible. So no, there's it is certainly a defense mechanism in humans, to split off your awareness into separate centers, each of them having access to different parts of your memory, to different egoic dispositions, making some repressed content aware through a separate alter, so to avoid the need to integrate and make sense of everything, which is challenging. But it's not the result of placebo in the sense that there's nothing going on. No, there's absolutely something going on. And from a therapy perspective, I think it does make a difference if the therapist truly takes this seriously as a proper dynamics of mind that does happen in people or not. I think patients will always pick it up. Even if not metacognitively, they will pick up whether their therapists are taking them seriously.
Mhm. The idea that mind is primary, as we just kind of talked about, tends to be kind of resistant for some people, whereas others are fairly open and intrigued by this. I've often wondered, I was actually mentioning this recently. I got the chance to interview Dr. Eben Alexander, who I know you're familiar with his work. And I made the comment to him, I said, if we are really looking at this as in Occam's razor, then idealism to me actually explains everything that are, like it makes the paranormal normal. And it kind of helps to explain that. So when you're looking at this idea that all is mind, from your perspective as not just someone who is a philosopher, but also has worked in artificial intelligence. I know you've worked on CERN and those kind of things. How does that awareness that mind is primary, how does that help people kind of view their lives and their connections with others and in the world, to maybe have a better, happier life?
It changes everything. It refutes immediately, for instance, the approach of Antonio Damasio and others that say our emotions are just side effects of evolutionarily conditioned mechanisms. Even empathy is a side effect of evolution, because the empathic reaction is supposed to increase your social cachet, because you helped somebody else in the tribe, so the tribe values you more, so you get a better chance of getting a good wife and have children, having the resources. And the feeling of empathy is just an inner side effect of that. If you buy into this kind of thing, then there is very little motivation for true psychological integration. You just don't take your emotions seriously. You think of yourself as a machine. Your emotions are just a side effect of a maladaptive machine, or a machine that's not working fine. So you just pop some pills. And I don't dismiss the value of pills. I take them myself because I have tinnitus, and it helps stop that spiral of tinnitus when you start telling yourself, I cannot stand this sound, and then the sound is still there, and then ooh, no. And psychiatric drugs help me deal with that. So I don't poo-poo psychiatric medication at all, but I also don't think that they replace the need to mature, to integrate everything that is going on in our minds, even the stuff we don't want to recognize about ourselves, to integrate the shadow, to integrate trauma, and to grow and to mature as a human being. So mind as primary reinvigorates the need to do that, the need to mature. And then it changes everything else, because if mind is primary, you have no reason to think that all the insights you've accumulated during your lifetime will just disappear the moment you die and will ultimately be for nothing. No, that possibility is off the table now. The insights you accumulate throughout your lifetime is something that you will give to nature at the moment of your death, because they will continue to be in mind if mind is the only thing there is. Now, you may not be dissociated from the rest of nature anymore at the moment you die, but that only means that your insights accumulated during a lifetime will be seeded in a much broader cognitive context, the mind of nature, if you will. So life becomes meaningful. Your suffering, which leads to insights and maturation, is now meaningful because it, it, it serves a grander purpose. Whether you want it or not, whether you believe it or not, your life is meaningful. It changes the way we relate to other people, to animals, because if we are all naturally dissociated complexes of a broader mind of nature, then we will eventually inherit their memories, including the memories of their suffering. And that should give us pause about how much suffering we want to inflict on others. In the food industry, raising pigs, which are animals very close to us, we can transplant organs from pigs to humans viably, so close they are to us, and we treat them like products, literally. Imagine a life of profound anxiety at all times. And when that animal dies, it seeds those memories into the broader cognitive context of which we are part. We are going to inherit that. We are going to inherit, well, Putin is going to inherit the suffering of the Ukrainian people. It should give it some thought. And also medicine changes, because if your body is what your inner mental life looks like, including the parts you repress, including the parts you cannot access through metacognitive introspection, if all of that presents itself to observation as your physical body, then what we call the body is essentially mental. And that means that next to drugs and surgery, there is a very important third avenue to cultivate physical health, and that is psychological therapy, talk therapy. And it goes a long way to explain the placebo effect, which we know is true. It happens, it's very strong. It's not a small effect, and we don't have an account for. Well, there is your account. If you internalize certain healthy psychic attitudes, mental attitudes, and you internalize that to the way that they become embodied, of course they will change your physical health, because your physical health is just the extrinsic appearance of deeply internalized mental health.
As a scientist, what going back in your life, when did you really start to feel like, number one, consciousness is truly important to study, and number two, this idea of idealism, analytical idealism? How young were you, and what kind of motivated you to explore that?
When I was at CERN, and I started at CERN at 22, 2 days after I graduated,
Wow.
We were doing data acquisition for the big accelerator experiment that has been running now for 10 years. No, 14 years, the LHC, the Large Hadron Collider. And we were applying some algorithms, classical algorithms that require an understanding of physics. That's how we implemented the data acquisition system at the end. But in parallel, I was running some experiments with AI, with artificial intelligences that didn't have the explicit knowledge of physics that we had, but would just train on huge amounts of data. And I wanted to see if that AI would be as clever as the algorithms based on our knowledge of physics. And they were very close. We didn't choose to use them because we didn't know how they worked. AI was a black box back then. Today, still somewhat of a black box, but less. But that got me thinking, if I can build an AI that is almost as clever as a Nobel Prize winning physicist to filter this data, what is missing for me to believe that this thing is not only intelligent, but conscious, that it has a conscious inner life of its own, that it is clever data processing is accompanied by an experience of that data processing, the same way that data processing in our brains seems to be accompanied by experience, or certainly is accompanied by experience. And for a few years, I struggled with that question, trying different structure, trying different function in the computers I was designing. And at some point you hit a wall and you realize that whatever you do or change or think about structure and function, all you will change is structure and function, which has nothing to do with qualitative aspects to that, with the experience of that. Nothing I could possibly think of could even in principle give me any reason to think that something that is intelligent now is also conscious. I had no reason for that, whatever I did. And then I came across a paper by philosopher David Chalmers in which he basically framed this problem in one very clear and unambiguous sentence. He said, there is nothing about physical parameters in terms of which we could deduce the qualities of experience, not even in principle. You cannot pull the territory out of the map. And then this statement became known as the hard problem of consciousness, which is not a problem in the same way that if you can't pull the territory out of the map, you don't say, well, that's a problem that I can solve in version 2 of the map. No, no, it's a fundamentally insoluble thing because you're thinking wrongly about it. And that's what I realized still in my 20s. I am thinking wrongly about this. I have absolutely no reason to think that any material configuration, any structure and function in a physical substrate will produce consciousness. And the moment I realized that, because to understand it is to immediately believe it, because it's obvious. So I immediately believed that, but the implication was, well, I have no inner narrative anymore, no tenable inner narrative in terms of which to make sense of the world. I don't know what's going on at a very fundamental level. So I started looking for a different narrative. And idealism is the most parsimonious, internally consistent, and empirically adequate available today if you think these things through carefully.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's I think that the whole consciousness, or excuse me, the unconscious of people, particularly I find in Western culture, is so fascinated lately with this idea of machine as man, man as machine, the whole transhumanism. I mean, going back to the early 80s or mid 80s when the Terminator series started in the movies. And I think there's a part of people down deep that are so fascinated to almost want to be a machine, but at the same time terrified that a machine could be a person. So it's like this is a constant theme of a lot of science fiction novels, and what is humanity, and who's creating the distinction of this is humanity and this isn't. And for me, going back to this view of idealism, that eliminates a lot of that kind of desire to be a machine and all, because of the systemic nature of everything, kind of putting it in like I said, all is connected, but taking out the hippie-esque part of it. Do you find that people who that you talk to who are open to this idea of idealism tend to, maybe it gives them more comfort in how they view like unfortunately things that are happening in the world now, or just the technological process that is just blazing so quickly?
I think we underestimate how much comfort materialism gives psychologically for an enormous number of reasons. There's a lot more psychology here interwoven in this whole story than reason. A lot more psychology than reason, a lot more ego defense than reasoning. Let me give you first the most obvious example. The greatest fear, the greatest anxiety of humans throughout almost the entirety of human history has been fear of the experiential state that follows death. What's going to happen to me after I die? Am I going to heaven or am I going to hell? That's the Christian way of describing this. But this was in paganism, this was in other religions. This has been the greatest anxiety of humanity throughout history, the experiential state post death. Materialism has taken this in one fell swoop off the table. You do not need to worry about that because you will experience nothing after death. So there is no more the greatest fear in the history of humanity.
Mhm.
That's extraordinarily comforting. And we don't know that because we were already born taking this for granted. But once idealism comes around and you start thinking about this again, that fear may return. So it's not as comforting as you'd like to think. And anybody who has had a strong psychedelic trip, and psychedelics are the best model for death we have now. They tremendously reduce brain activity, which is what happens when you're dying, when brain activity stops. And you can have some very bad trips. So that's one point. Another point is in the field of AI, and I know that because I was in that environment for a long time, and for a long time as a believer that we could create artificial consciousness. Remember Freud's idea that women have penis envy, that they have envy, the envy of this appendage that only men have and they don't. There is such a thing as womb envy amongst AI researchers. The psychological appeal of the power of bringing a living being into existence is tremendous. It a lot of fluid compensation goes into that in terms of a source of meaning. If you've lost meaning because you're an atheist, you don't have transcendent meaning, and if you lost all the other sources of meaning, you fluid compensate towards the ability to create a living creature that invests your life with a tremendous sense of meaning and egoic control. Your ego is now has a godly power, a divine power to bring actual conscious life into the world. Womb envy is a big thing there, and therefore it motivates all the mythology that has a reason around that. Black Mirror and AI movies and all that nonsense. So womb envy is another one. And finally, transhumanism, which is a form of religious expression that instead of entailing a surrender of the ego to a higher power, like in Catholicism, now if you're reborn under Christianity, you're basically surrendering yourself to Jesus. Or Islam, and the word Islam means surrender. And they prostrate themselves 5 times a day to a higher power, which is a moving thing, a wonderful thing. But all of these true religious intuitions, they are based on reaching transcendence through the surrender of the ego. But in transhumanism, the idea is to reach transcendence by reinforcing the ego, by making the ego a god. You don't need anymore the intermediation of an external divine entity that shares your values and therefore will apply justice in the way you see justice to be. You can do that directly now because you have this divine engineering power over nature, the power to extend your life forever, to upload your consciousness into silicon computers, the power to create intelligences beyond any of our abilities to conceive, the power to bring your dad back to life, which is Ray Kurzweil motivation. I mean, it's an obvious psychological issue the man has and never really sorted out. I lost my father too very early at 12. I integrated that. I've made my peace with that. Today I look back and I think that was essential for me to be who I have become, and I'm grateful to my father for for having passed away, which is something that's mind-boggling, right?
Mhm.
It was tough love, but it was an act of love. I learned much later that he had heart disease. He never told anybody, and he never treated it. So he was largely responsible for his death.
Mhm.
I have forgiven him, and I'm even thankful to him. But Ray never even begun the journey down this road. He wants to bring his dad back through a computer. So that's the religious intuition and the religious drive never disappeared. It just expresses itself according to different narratives. And materialist transhumanism is one of those narratives. So this whole thing, Paul, this whole thing is not driven by reason and evidence. It's driven by ego defense mechanisms. And when you realize that, it's shocking and scary until you get used to it.
Yeah, well, I had read somewhere someone made the comment that with all the new technology and transhumanistic things, it said that Dr. Frankenstein's cadaver laboratory has been replaced with computers and assorted new tech, but it's that kind of this first time I've heard womb envy in this context, and I think wow, there's a lot of stuff there. When you were talking about comforting, I recently saw an interview with you and Dr. Michael Shermer. It was really just a discussion, not a debate or an interview. But and you were just kind of giving your point. He was asking questions. At the end, I found it very funny because for those who don't know who Dr. Shermer is, Michael Shermer is a known skeptic. He has a background of the history and philosophy of science. And he said to you, but there's some things about this idealism that's very comforting to me. And you immediately said, well, actually something about materialism is actually more comforting to me. So,
Well, to me it was. Um, but I will acknowledge one thing. One thing that idealism brings back big time to life is meaning. Meaning is now, it percolates everything, the whole world around you. It goes through you and out into the world and back. There is no way of escaping meaning in any sense under an idealist worldview, because now the world is just an appearance of a deeper reality. So that dimension of mystery, that extra dimension of mystery and meaning is reinvested into the world. The world is no longer flat. It's a superficial appearance or representation of a deeper reality. And your insights are no longer for nothing. They will never disappear. They will be seeded into the broader cognitive context of nature upon your death. So meaning comes back. And as Jung once said, if you have meaning, you can face anything, probably everything. He had these words in his biography. If you go back to the 20th century with Paul Tillich and Man in Search of Meaning, what was
Viktor Frankl.
Viktor Frankl, you see that these people were tapping into the vacuum left by an absence of meaning that we try to compensate fluid compensation through closure, through egoic power, all these other things we do to compensate for a lack of transcendent meaning. That has been a big wound, in the chest of the Western worldview since the mid 19th century, since Nietzsche announced the death of God, and that wound is closed. That hole is not on my chest anymore, and this is big. This is very big. I complain that idealism makes life worse in some other respects, but I gotta be honest to myself and say that on balance, I am better off. I prefer to have anxiety and meaning than to not be anxious about death, but live in a hollow, flat world with no significance.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it reminds me of the Joseph Campbell quote about that we don't, what we're needing is not so much the purpose, but the experience of being alive. And with that experience, there's the meaning. And as you say, that we will, not being human, have that anxiety. But that's really, we'll take the anxiety as long as we can have that experience and that meaning to go along with it.
And that experience is the opposite of the banalization of the world
Mhm.
under which we still live in the mainstream. We've turned everything banal. We now take representations for the thing in itself.
Right.
In other words, the world is just that, nothing more than, or just this or that. Now, this language, oh, it's just this or nothing more than, this language disappears under idealism. Nothing is just that. Everything is a symbol with a deeper dimension of meaning and significance and mystery.
Mhm.
So yeah, that's big. I gotta admit that.
Well, anything to, I think, to shift our perspective from a ego-centered to a little, there's more to the world than just me, I think is usually a good thing. This is the science nerd in me. Popper's whole thing of falsification, how do you deal with that from your theory or perspective?
Well, the first thing to keep in mind is that what Popper meant by hypothesis having to be falsifiable is predictive behavioral models. In other words, scientific theories that predict the behavior of nature. So if you say, no, if a very basic scientific theory everybody can understand is if I release two spheres of different weights, will they hit the ground at the same time, or the heavier one will hit the ground first? That's Galileo's experiment. He dropped the balls from the top of a tower, and guess what? They arrived at the ground at the same time. So the hypothesis that the heaviest object falls faster was falsified. And what was falsified was a behavioral prediction. We predicted a certain behavior of nature. Nature would behave as such that the heavier ball falls first. We predicted that, and we falsified that through experiment. Now, a ontology, a metaphysical view, is not a predictive scientific theory. It's not predicting nature's behavior. It's making an educated guess about what nature is. What is the nature of that which behaves? So falsifiability doesn't apply directly to any metaphysics, because metaphysics are not predictive scientific models. They are educated guesses about what nature is, not how it behaves. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. A lot of people conflate these two things. Now, having said that, any metaphysics that contradicts nature's behavior as proven by science is just wrong. If you have a metaphysics that makes us, that implies something about nature that turns out to not be the way nature behaves, then that's false. So let's take materialism. Materialism implies that physical entities exist in and of themselves. They don't depend on anything else to exist. They are not images of something else, representations of something else. They are the thing in itself. They have standalone existence. It turns out that from experiments done over 40 years in the field of foundations of physics, this implication is contradicted by experiment. So physicalism is falsified. Now, is idealism falsifiable? In principle, it is, because if science shows something that contradicts an implication of idealism, then idealism is false. Has that happened so far? No, not to idealism. It has happened basically to everything else. Can I devise a scientific experiment that aims precisely at falsifying idealism? Perhaps, but not as directly as you can devise a scientific experiment to falsify a behavior prediction, because that's what science is about. Science is about predicting the behavior of nature, not what nature is. So in principle, idealism could have been falsified by the neuroscience of consciousness and foundations of physics, but that didn't happen. Now, 40 years on, everything else has been falsified. Now, I don't think I should be embarrassed by the fact that nobody has managed to refute idealism or falsify idealism, because the hypothesis is that it's true. And if it's true, it wouldn't have been falsified. Is it in principle falsifiable? Yes, but not in as direct a way as people would like to think, because of this difference between science and philosophy.
Yeah. Well, the time has just flown by. I'm just enjoyed this little chat, and I think we could probably have done a couple of hours because I'm fascinated by how you see the world, not just in consciousness, but in general. But before we get close to wrapping it up, I wanted to ask you if you would talk a little bit about this new foundation that you've set up, and how people who are interested in your work, how they could find out more about that.
So the foundation is Essentia Foundation. Essentia is written with a T at the end, like in Latin. Essentia Foundation.org. With a good friend of mine, Fred Matter, is the founder and chairman of this foundation. And the goal is the following. Historically, idealism as a philosophical hypothesis has been associated with religious streams from East and West, especially the East, has been associated with non-dualism, Buddhism, in the West with Neoplatonism, even occultism at some point. And these are lines of argument that are fundamentally based on first-person experience, on introspection. So you come out of a meditative session saying, well, I've discovered that everything is mind, Buddhism. Or you read the Upanishads, where the sages interpreted the Vedas, and the Vedas were written out of direct introspective insight, and a form of idealism comes out of that. So there has been this solid foundation for idealism based on first-person introspective insight, spiritual insight, if you will. But there is no organization out there that is promoting the objective argument for idealism based on empirical evidence and logical reasoning instead of introspection. There are three grand avenues to knowledge. Introspection is the royal avenue, but you also have logical reasoning from the Greeks, started with the Greeks, and the Buddhists use that too, and empirical evidence, which is what the West excelled in determining and collecting. So we thought, you know what, we can make a more than sufficient case for idealism without even touching on introspection. Not that introspection is bad, but in the whole balance of things, it has not been paid any attention at all. The empirical and logical reasoning behind idealism. So we started this foundation to focus on the logical and empirical reasons to conclude that idealism is true, and not touch on the spiritual and introspective side at all, because others are already doing that. Not because we are against it, but others are already doing that. We leave that to them, and we focus on the science and the analysis of the best we know today in analytic philosophy and all the branches of science.
And I noticed your board and memberships include computer scientists like yourself, philosophers, psychologists, medical doctors, social scientists, artists. I mean, so you have a wide variety of viewpoints to kind of assist in this goal that you have to help spread this. And I think that's kind of exciting.
We were surprised how many contributions we got, how many idealists were out there that we didn't know. Yes, it's becoming a movement with a significant amount of momentum now.
Yeah, maybe it's more comforting than you and I are giving it credit for then.
Well, for people who are undecided, who are on the wall, it's important that they see that there are many people with very, very heavy degrees and very, very solid resumes out there who are sticking their neck out and saying, guys, idealism is the way to go, and nothing else does the job. Nothing else is tenable, because we live in a culture in which we need to trust some form of authority. Human knowledge is now too vast for any one person to be able to critically assess everything. It has become completely impossible. So it's important for people who are, sitting on the fence to see that even if you don't trust this or that authority figure, now there are so many
Right.
coming out and saying this is the way to go, that it's impossible to just claim that, oh, it's just some fringe stuff promoted by gullible nonsense people. No, you can't do that anymore. No.
Yeah. Well, lastly, I know that you're quite prodigious in your output with writing. As I mentioned, you have over 10 books, which people can find in all the major media outlets, Amazon, etc. What's the best place for people to find your work, your blog, all those kind of things that if they're really interested?
If they go to bernardokastrup.com, so one word, Bernardo Kastrup, Kastrup with a K, and finishing with a P for Peter. There are links to essays, academic papers, videos, podcasts, books. Everything's linked from there.
Okay.
Most of it free.
Yeah. Well, Bernardo, I've really enjoyed this, and I have been so honored for that you, as busy as you are, you took the time out for me, and I appreciate that. Thank you for sharing your knowledge, your perspective, and your humanity with me today.
Thanks for having me, Paul. It's been a pleasure.